Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The strategy panel has the task to deal with questions. What elements should be part of strategy? How should strategic thinking be organized? Very difficult topic, cannot really be answered so simply. And questions of war theory. We have 4 speakers. Professor Honig, unfortunately, won't be with us. He gave a great lecture here last year. I would like to introduce the speakers. 2 will speak in German and 2 in English. General Horst Walter, who was also my teacher here at the Academy, he has trained a whole generation of officers. His special area was tactics of the services and has also worked in various defense aspects, and due to his considerable experience, he will talk about Colonel Lauch, sitting next to him. I got to know him by very intensive email contacts. Is a very special case. He was with MVA. Was trained in the Soviet Union as a planner for operations against the West, then joined the German Bundeswehr and NATO. And a very, very interesting CV indeed. General.
A lot of very interesting facts about hybrid and propaganda infiltrations in Asia and Europe. I don't know if he will go into that this afternoon, but he has a very broad band of information. He is a general, changed over to academic life, and I'm looking forward to his presentation. General Anderson. He will discuss how much is in Europe and in NATO the current prospects and the current qualifications of looking into the willingness to defend the West is still deteriorating or is, let's say, getting better again. You remember the last folio of Colonel Peischl a few minutes ago. I do not really think that the United States will contract like that, but that's probably subject of our debate. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the command of the Landesverteidigungsakademie asked me to cover a few topics that you probably will not have a chance to look into afterwards, and I will change over to German. Okay. Das Thema, das wir heute Nacht...
The topics that we were supposed to discuss this afternoon, I don't know whether we will have time to discuss it, is actually the question: who writes strategies? What should a strategy contain? What does a strategy look like? How is the leitmotif presented? How is it embedded? What is the impact? And who reads strategies? My experience is not always positive here. I would like to point out that until the 50s we did have no national strategies that were covering this wide framework. We had operational analysis, we had various instructions, the colored war plans in the US, the rainbow plans, ABC-1, ABC-41, and so on. And we had strategic approach against German submarines after 94. After 45, we had 30 to 50 nuclear planning approaches. mixed with conventional planning. These were large global strategies. If they weren't purely nuclear strategies. If you're interested, I'm willing to talk about this after our official program. The first one published in the US, meaning a strategy that actually had the character of a grand strategy, was in 68 by Paul Hinzinger. And you heard Tim Anderson gave a talk in front of the press club. The line of interest of the United States includes Japan, but did not include Korea. And this is why Kim Il-sung then decided he was not actually covered by the American defense line in the Western Pacific. So this is something that came up in the later analyses. So what do we have today? And please distinguish this from doctrines. There are many war doctrines, and this is different. Colonel Richter actually showed us that at the moment when the pillars of a strategy, of a possible scenario, are being blurred into the gray zone, a strategy is almost a fiction. This means, and to get out of a fiction and isolate real planning requires a lot of luck. Many of these strategies are rather superficial. Many strategies actually leave out the military in large part. For example, Great Britain until 98 had no strategy. It had a constitution, but no strategy. Many of these things became fads, or were considered fads, rather. Also, the fact that many countries set up national security councils. Take a look at strategy papers of small countries. You will see that actually they might have been written by a 16-year-old. There are usually some general statements, nothing specific. What you have to distinguish is military planning. What is called deliberate planning or crisis action plans, preemptive strike planning. Now here there is a lot of literature, and you will find a lot. Another point I would like to make, there are many wars that were waged without strategy. The American Civil War had no strategy. After 1915, the entire war on the Western Front was waged without any strategy. There were campaigns, yes, and local planning, certainly for certain attacks. And apart from the example of the U.S. since 1987, with the National Security Strategy that was adopted in 87, and there is now, I think, the 7th edition already, or the 18th edition. There is a defense strategy written by the Secretary of Defense and the National Military Strategy. The content is entirely the same. It's just the cover sheet that has a different typo. And almost any country, and this brings me to the end, has if it is necessary for political and strategic reasons, they have rewritten strategies. The U.S. have about 30 strategies. There is no strategy for the overall country, but there are strategies for naval war, for air strikes, for homeland security, for counterintelligence, intelligence. There is a strategy on the part of the State Department for the diplomatic service, and there are strategies for cyber defense. Once you have read one, you have read them all, because they're all the same. So, I would like to get started with our first speaker. This is General Walter, and then we will try to maybe have a brief discussion and do a summary. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The interaction between individuals is seen as the origin of strategy. The language enables us to describe the world. It enables us to change the world a little and also to create it in part. Language may be called as the most noble way of expressing one's opinion, but you can also put this differently, as Talleyrand said when a Spanish envoy asked him for his promise that was due to be fulfilled. Well, he replied, the language is given to man to hide his thoughts. End of quote. 70 years earlier, Voltaire actually went a step further. He said, man uses language mainly to justify his wrongs. I would like to state beforehand the principle of unity of language and culture. The knowledge of languages is impossible without understanding the culture, and vice versa. Cultural understanding is not really possible without knowing the language. We can see this very clearly in international deployments of troops, where it's important to actually have an understanding of the local culture and also to deal with other military officers in order to be able to act together. Despite various alliances, this is still a challenge. If we look at strategy as a long-term plan to reach an objective that is far away, we cannot really just use a rigid long-term plan. The volatile, insecure, and ambivalent world calls for flexibility and a dynamic approach. And in order to meet this flexibility demands, we need a bundle of activities and measures. And therefore, and for this, language could be one of the means, is usually one of them, or has to be one of them, rather. Ladies and gentlemen, let me look at language as a means to change society. This is not a short-term process. We live in the language and with the language, and we live from the language. It shapes us, and we use the language. We use the language in order to put an order into the world. And sometimes our vocabulary can be compared to a table that is a real mess, where we may come up with creative solutions, fake news being one of them. To change society has always been the liberation of some nuisances or the idea of new man, new humankind. Together with this, we usually see a devaluation of old principles and values. And as an example, I would like to mention the term repressive tolerance. This is an oxymoron that Herbert von Malthus coined, and that actually describes that was taken up by the 68ers. The social market economy is looked upon as a means of fogging up and obfuscating the true values of capitalism. And parliamentary democracy, the representative democracy, are both means and instruments of this repressive tolerance. Long-term in a long-term way, this is not true. It hasn't led to turning society into a communist society, but some of these influences are still being felt. For example, the change in the acceptance of authorities. What is dangerous is when a group actually achieves the sovereignty of interpretation in a language by decreeing certain terms and idioms. There a mock world arises, and we have to be subordinate to this world, and we cannot really counter it with the means of empiricism. This leads in a positive way to a verbal disarmament for living together, but on the other hand, it may also lead to an ethic of convictions all the way to the loss of the freedom of opinion. I would also like to mention here political correctness. Originally, the intention was to provide a level playing field for everybody, for all the members of the society, so that they have access to the public discussions, and to create a situation where everybody is heard. But what has happened is attention was diverted and has actually focused on seemingly important issues. For example, the discussion on the color of the skin, and the second one, even more serious in a way, the idea that went the way of an ethic of convictions, almost a terror of convictions. The promoting of the pleasure principles that was propagated by Spinoza, where the shift is to physical pleasures, actually has led to a society where the consumption actually plays an important role. And this is something that is, of course, the advertising, which is driven by maximizing profits, because the dignity of human beings is determined by their ability to consume. So the offensive use of question, I would like to mention a few positive examples, that the fact to promote bilingualism and multilingualism in the European Union is part of the European integration process. And we have the European language seal for innovative language products. This is a word that is connected with money that is supposed to be used for language activities. The language school of the academy here actually got the prize a few years ago. The language is also used, of course, in certain fields, in business and security. The dominance of a language depends on the economic power behind it, the military power behind it, by the political weight behind it, not necessarily by the number of people speaking that particular language. Part of interoperability efforts in NATO refers to languages. NATO, for this purpose, has a body, the Bureau for International Language Coordination, that was an advisory body before and is now actually a staff department. And the aim is the standardization of language training and the standardization of language certificates and language tests. Connected with this kind of work is also the training efforts regarding culture, where it is important. Well, it is done in a decentralized way under the aegis of NATO in the various countries that are partners of this particular project. Also, on the cultural side, there are exchanges, exchanges to promote one's own interests. If I can manage to actually have my language recognized and integrated into the educational curricula of another country, I can influence the perception of my culture in that particular country. A further of an area where a lot of things could be done is, of course, the educational sector. Tolerant, for example, all the way to deception. And here we get into politics, diplomacy, and the media, of course. Digitization and the social media have had an incredible reach for language and are all pervasive. Language manipulation, this starts in a very simple way by suggesting valuations. It continues in the obfuscation of the actual connections. It uses storytelling, framing, and narratives. Storytelling is a method of telling stories where explicit and implicit knowledge is packed into a metaphor in order to make them accessible to the audience. Content management is a more modern version here. Framing means it is using the own view of the world in order to influence listeners. In politics, this means that you make yourself appear authentic ideologically, and then you speak in very clear images, using very clear language, promoting one's own interest, one's own worldview. A master of framing is Donald Trump. So what happens in the brains of the listeners is there is an interpretation frame that's created, and they are connecting then their own experience with the narrative, with the story being told. We don't need to go into the details of narrative. Every wrong starts with a lie. An example here. When you allocate blame on a minority is being accused for being responsible for the problems of the majority, and what you follows is history as we all know it. Filtering is another way of manipulation. Publications and are not translated into the dominant language, maybe because of lack of interest, but also because for ideological reasons in order to stop a knowledge transfer. Documents are being translated wrongly, incorrectly, in order to actually give room to another interpretation. And the comparative of the filter is the exclusion of knowledge, of groups, of ethnic groups, for example. Language policy is a political field of maintaining a language and using a language. Starting point is usually the national language in a given country. The national language is the basis for the identity. So small wonder that after the breakup of an association of countries, the newly formed states do not want to draw a line between their language and the language that was the shared language before, see Yugoslavia. But also, the national language is the basis and the starting point for acquiring other languages. When you're using a language, here we could also distinguish between working languages that are used in business and politics, languages of different spheres of interest. This could be geostrategic interests, or maybe it's just market-driven interest. Then the languages of neighboring countries, neighboring languages, this is important for mutual disaster assistance, the languages of news and intelligence, and future languages. What are future languages? These are languages where there is an important development behind, which should be considered in time. All these languages and their uses have as a backdrop the terminology work. For the reason that I mentioned, that in the various languages and cultures, connotations of terms vary greatly. I have to mention that not even in the military cooperation it's always very clear what terms mean, and that because of this problem, of this terminological problem in many instructions, we can see, even though they were drawn up together, that the various different cultures are fighting with each other. And getting into arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to show briefly how important language is. It's not only a language of communication, but because of its cultural impact, it is a very efficient strategic tool indeed. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Herr Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Korkisch. Thank you for your introduction. Now, let me briefly refer to my background. I'm quite exotic here. I served for 40 years in both German armies, 24 years in the NVA, 16 years in the Bundeswehr. And then I spent 7 years in a military history research institution where I wrote down my insights, my knowledge, my experience. So everything that wasn't known in the German Democratic Republic and everything that was so complicated that you have to write it down. That was my personal obligation. I felt that this material should exist for people who in maybe 10, 15, 20 years' time want to write a PhD thesis so that they would learn directly from a man who knows from first-hand experience. So the subject of our panel will be presented from the perspective of Russian military science. Well, selective because the development of the military science of Russian Federation and the basis of military thinking and action was sent to Mr. Peischl, Brigadier Peischl, more than a month ago, and I hope that part of it will be published this year and the second part maybe next year. Maybe my contributions can help to make sure that the interests and the way of thinking of the Russian side can be better understood. So, how do the Russians tick? Let me give you a pointer. The thinking and action is no better or worse than it is in NATO. It's just completely different. It took me years to learn about this and to understand it. ladies and gentlemen. I would like to give you a presentation on the development of the General Staff Academy in Russia and new aspects of Russian military science. My presentation is based on sources of the Russian specialized press after taking over from Vasily Gerasimov as a Chief of Staff, General Staff of the Russian Federation, Valery, yes, at the end of 2012. And also based on my own experience, I studied at the Frunze Academy in Moscow for 4 years. I will talk about 3 aspects. First, I will talk about the question of the development of the training of the General Staff Academy, the responsibility of the General Staff Academy, not only as a military institution of training and education, but also as a research center and a think tank in Russian society. And thirdly, I intend to also relate about my experience while I studied at the Frunze Academy in Russia. Now, as to the third point, if you wish, in the ensuing debate, I can elaborate on that more. As to the development of the General Staff Academy, on the 18th of December of 2017 was the 185th anniversary of the foundation of the Military Academy of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. It is on this day that in 1832, in the presence of Tsar Nicholas I in St. Petersburg, the ceremonial opening of the Tsarist Military Academy took place. After the death of the Tsar in 1855, it was renamed the Imperial Nikolai Military Academy. Already in the early 1750s, Field Marshal Pyotr Shuvalov pointed out the necessity of creating a higher military educational institution. However, this intention was only realized in 1830 by the Swiss general and influential military theorist Henry Iomini in the name of Tsar Nicholas I. The academy matured into a training ground for officers to serve in the general staff and contributed to expand military knowledge. The main task of the academy consisted in making sure that elite military should be trained for use in the state and in the military, and to provide them with a broad education. With the October Revolution of 1917, and the violent takeover of power by the communist Bolsheviki and the leadership of Lenin, he postulated the establishment of the General Staff Military Academy in Moscow in 1918. So in 1925 it was called Mikhail Vasilyevich Frunze. During the Civil War and the intervention in the conflict, this training center prepared a considerable number of troop leaders who made a substantial contribution to victory in the war over the foreign military forces. On the 2nd of April 1936, the Soviet leadership decided to reform the General Staff Academy and entrusted it with the training of troop leaders at higher levels of command, and at the same time as researching military science. So in October of 1945, the Academy began its 2-year training course. It initially comprised 2 main subjects and a higher academic course. In 1946, the Faculty of Air Forces opened, and in 1949, the Faculty of Naval and Military History opened. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 21st of December 1991, the General Staff Academy once again developed into the highest military, educational and scientific institution of the Russian Federation. Now, from now on, it qualifies military cadres for the armed forces, primarily, for ministries, the public administration of the Russian Federation, and for the armed forces of other states. The Academy scientists participate, among other things, in the development of the military doctrine of the Russian Federation, legal documents, and the regulation of competencies of the armed forces at times of peace and war. They deal with questions of guaranteeing collective security in the post-Soviet area and peacekeeping. And this think tank also works out complex studies on behalf of the Ministry of Defense. Some of the results are the study of the modern character of armed fight, building up and developing the armed forces of the Russian Federation, some of the priority tasks of military science to ensure national defense, and also how to wage modern wars, the defense of the state and other problems of military science. So during his first speech in January of 2013, the Gerasimov Doctrine, as it was referred to, but there is no Gerasimov Doctrine. That's just his first fundamental speech, and that's what it is about. So in his first speech, he explained to representatives of the government and the armed forces of the Russian Federation that the military experience gained so far was beneficial, especially those of the Great Patriotic War, the Cold War, and the wars up to the present. So these normative claims take me to the second question, the responsibility of the Academy as a military training institution. The main goals and objectives of the Academy were, well, the training of cadres in the interest of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, ministries and other institutions, like I said before. Secondly, the conduct of basic and applied scientific research in the field of the establishment and the deployment of the armed forces and national security of the Russian Federation. The students are trained in 3 faculties. The first faculty is the Faculty of National Security and Defense of the State. The second, the Faculty for Retraining and Further Training. And thirdly, the Special Faculty for the Study of Foreign Military Personnel. So at this faculty, about 4,000 members of the military from more than 50 countries have been trained. So they offer a study in 12 faculties of military science, and these are shown in this diagram. Now, in the past few years, scientists of the General Staff Academy have been investigating the picture of future conflicts. They assess conflicts of the future, for example, digitization, autonomization, automation, and robotization. Networked or connected hybrid combat operations, different forms and methods of using armed forces, and so-called color revolutions, as well as experiences of anti-terrorist operations in Syria. Narratives such as cyber, hybridity, and resilience cannot be found in the Russian military literature the way it is reflected in Western media. So NATO focuses on political interests and also economic ideas, and the Russian armed forces consider this as a form of modern warfare. So the individual parts of the army, air force, etc., well, they need to react in a deployment-oriented way. So these new forms are reflected in new principles of the art of war. We discussed this morning. Let me just mention 2 of those, such as the principle of independence and autonomy. That's a completely new idea. fighting operations and skirmishes are no longer on a large scale, but they are small scale, maybe based on brigades, in the operative strategic arena. So these are independent operations or fights. And the second principle that is now coming out and emerging is information management or information campaigns. The Russian government and the general staff, of course, have attributed a significant role to the academy for the further development of the armed forces. Their task is to identify trends and topics of military science and to analyze these. This means optimize the security structures and solutions in the interest of the general staff and Russian society as a pan-societal task. Now, quite briefly, I'd like to talk about 4 subjects, but very briefly. So, basically, if you want to see the whole picture, we could say that the General Staff Academy of the Russian Federation is dealing, firstly, with what is modern war all about, what does it mean, what principles are applied. Second, what do the armed forces have to prepare for? Thirdly, how should they be armed and equipped? And fourthly, and that's a decisive question, that's what we are dealing here, how should the troop leaders and commanders be trained at the technical, operational and strategic level? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end my presentation, and if you're interested, I'm ready to answer any questions concerning my studies at the Frunze Academy. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm thus at the end of my presentation.
This? Yes. 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 Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that I think a lot yesterday and today about the hybrid warfare. I would like to present my point of view. I think that it will be a little bit different, and we will see. First of all, I would like to say that not only Russia and not only Ukraine are involved in the hybrid warfare, what we have nowadays, and I would like to say that we have more actors, more fighting heroes, and that we are victims. But we will see in some minutes after my brief. Yes, I would like to go back to very famous General Valery Gerasimov, not because of only his speech, which of course gave the picture of future wars. He didn't use the term the hybrid war, but he described almost everything what is going on now in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine. What he said, and I would like to underline only one sentence, except, of course, this very popular now, this using of political, economical, psychological information, socio-humanitarian, not only military activities. This is the answer I will support you, Professor. Gerasimov has reported that goals of war had been changed. Nowadays, it's no longer the purpose of the enemy to occupy the territory of another state or to conquest its military forces. The hybrid war has a new aim. The most important objective is to weaken the enemy and force them to follow imposed directions. Now Ukraine, some sentences. I'm associated with Ukraine as some years ago, active general, nowadays from some years as a professor, researcher. I spent over 4 years as a leader of NATO educational program in Ukraine. I supported reforms of education in Ukraine, and it was good occasion to conduct not only some researches, and one of many was the research about the hybrid war. Also, I studied some other conflicts, Afghanistan, and also actions of biggest states having a decisive influence on global security, and this is very important. What is the result of my research? What is the hybrid war in Ukraine? Of course, my research confirmed everything what was very clear for everybody, and now I know that you are familiar, especially these very traditional forms of fighting, sabotage, diversion, use of drones, satellites, very modern technology, and more and more and more. But from my point of view, what is the most important is the aim of this hybrid war. Main strategic objective, which is committed to defeat Russia, is not defeat of Ukraine, but her way of returning to the West or losing aspirations of Ukraine to join NATO and the European Union. This is not a hybrid war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is only a small element of a larger picture. Russia is conducting hybrid warfare with United States, with NATO, with European Union countries. It is a war not only about Crimea and Donbass, but also about the position in the world. To remain a powerful power and hegemony in the world, Russia is weakening, especially economically, and this is the main problem, but very soon you will see that not only for Russia. The activities of Russia in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, they have a long-term, strategic objectives you can see on the screen. What is the most important is the status of a superpower playing an important role in the world as a priority, and also as a priority creating the conditions for the reconstruction of the collective entity of the countries for Eastern Europe and Asia with the dominant role of Russia. Of course, the status of superpower means the priority, but Crimea also still, of course, exists, and I don't want to say that it's not important. What Russia did in Ukraine, a lot of activities, a lot of different actions, but what is important, and maybe the most important, this is the hybrid activity, which we call the information war. And you see that this main Russia's action has a big impact of information, not only in Ukraine. This is why I said that maybe we are also victims of the hybrid war, and maybe not only about this one hybrid war. Because it would be wrong to conclude my opinion on hybrid wars concerns only Russia. In the modern world, hybrid conflict lasts mainly between the three superpowers: Russia, United States, and China. What is happening in Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, or Iran direct to and comes from the ongoing conflict of the hybrid between these powers. Of course, everything is very deeply and in details. I wrote and published in Poland the book about the hybrid war in Ukraine, and I try to show a lot of details, because with no details it's difficult to explain and to present this theory. Why United States, why Russia, and why China? And this is the first step when I want to show the strategy, because I absolutely believe that especially in Europe we have problems with strategies. I don't want to say that we don't have strategies, but very often our strategy has not 15, 20, 25 years, 2 sometimes, 3 years. And from the election to the election, we change our strategies immediately. It means, you understand what I want to say. Each of these aim, United States, for me is very clear. World predomination, influence countries, all continents, economically, politically. China is similar. China is going to press, and of course this pressure is very clear. This is fight for the position of global leadership, nothing more. And Russia, hegemon, military, of course, very strong, but economically it's not the same. Of course, the aim and strategy, not bad strategy, I can assess, of course, is very clear. Some examples, because we need many hours to explain and to show in details. Some examples which presented this fight with using very modern assets. It's not only information. Of course, everybody uses information. It's not only economy. This is technology, and very modern technology. Why? To achieve this first play, because all superpowers, they want to be first. Yes, you have some examples. And some evidences, because the superpowers race and the pursuit on their full domination confirms following statements from recent months, not years. First is Vladimir Putin. But it's no secret what he said. Artificial intelligence is the future not only for Russia, but also for all humankind. The one who will become a leader in this spirit will be the first, will be the leader of the world. And very popular and famous James Mattis, and new strategy of United States. It's not terrorism now. Terrorism is not the priority for US. Nowadays, it's very clear that the priority is the competition with Russia and China. Competition may be something more than competition, okay? Maybe rivalry. And Russian ambassador to China is almost the same language. China, US, and Russia, independent centers. International affairs are largely shaped by the influence of these centers. And one more generals like generals, yes. One more general, also very popular, General Paul Silva. The world has been dominated by the competition of three superpowers. They are separate threats. It's very clear. And recommendations, because I'm absolutely sure that having three superpowers with very clear strategies, we observe that they are fighting using hybrid methods, not only Russia. The victims of hybrid strategy of superpowers are a number of countries on all continents, including European countries, which affects not only Russia, but also sometimes United States. Also, China are trying to win their place in Europe, which might be important in the future. Hybrid strategies cover a very broad spectrum of impact. Monitoring and preventing these strategies is extremely difficult, and the large capacities are needed. The potential of these three countries is so huge that to oppose the hybrid activities is very difficult for one country. Of course, some attempts are made. You can see in Europe, especially Germany, France, Britain, work in this direction intensively. In Asia, good examples are India and Japan, which they trying to counter the threat from China, but also many countries started to become independent from the United States. It should be said that capabilities of each of the superpowers is so large that no one country is able to meet the hybrid challenges. What is the solution for Europe? What is the solution for our countries, many countries, not superpowers? According not only to my recommendations, consolidating efforts and opportunities, creating joint strategies and joint actions against hybrid action is only one way. I'm not sure it's possible way, a realistic way, but only one way if we want to be ready to meet first or second or third challenge from this hybrid conflict or hybrid conflicts. The countries of the European Union have a huge role to play here, although they see how much they are divided by superpowers. They do not too much to develop effective forms of defense. And we need to combine European instruments capable of opposing and counteracting hybrid threats. It's necessary to develop a European defense system broadly understood in the face of discard that begins between NATO countries of America and Europe. European collaboration in the field of defense cannot be only a paper. We have combat groups, very famous combat group. I spent 2 years in Africa as a deputy commander of big operation in 26 countries. And 2 years we were asking about the strategic reserve. It was no one volunteer from European Union because it was EU operation to give support from the battle group, combat group. It's necessary seriously and together to think and act against the threats of terrorism also and cross-border threats. There is a need of a real European strategy and real actions on the most important sectors on the functioning of status. Everything is not possible. We have to find priorities, and priorities except military area, of course, from my point of view, first of all is infrastructure, energy, transport, financial area, cyberspace, and information. Priorities. A common political and economic strategy is needed, not only declared, but completed. Because we have declarations, we have programs, we try to implement something, but the analysis of European Union activities, a new strategy in the field of security and defense, implementation of European Defense Action Plan last time, do not give reasons for optimism. As usually, the European Union declares good directions and actions, but they lacking effective tools of executing. Assessing instruments of all member states which are possible for use in constructing and fulfilling security strategy, like diplomacy, armed forces, economic, information potentials, of course I can assess that it's possible, but everything depends on our governments of our countries. Still, individual national interest or even party interest to obtain as many votes as possible in elections are main indicators. One could imagine that common superior interest of United States would bring much more outstanding effects. Thank you very much.
Generals, admirals, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this interesting and forward-looking conference. Secondly, I would say I'm very lucky to have the last briefing this evening. I'm even double lucky, because after this panel I will make the real final speech for tonight. So I will be very brief on this first one. I don't have any slides. I will bomb you with slides later on. I will talk briefly about the Swedish strategy, moving into strategy as an overall term. Speaking of strategy from a Swedish perspective, you have to be aware of at least two facts, I think. Firstly, we heard earlier today about the downsizing of the German Bundeswehr. The Swedish armed forces have changed dramatically during the last 25 years. In the middle of the 1990s, the Swedish mobilized armed forces consisted of approximately 800,000 personnel in arms, out of a population of 8 million. Almost 10% of the population could be put under arms. Now, the armed forces has a size of approximately 40,000 personnel out of a population of 10 million. So it's a real dramatic downsizing. And the focus of the Swedish armed forces until recently has been on missions abroad. The task from our government was to be able to keep 2,000 personnel abroad on 2 different missions. That was the task. We never did that. So that's one of the facts. Secondly, when I attended an advanced course of the Swedish National Defense College, we did not really talk much about strategy or ground strategy. We talk about operations, mainly. My first real contact with Clausewitz or Sun Tzu was when I attended the United States Marine Corps Commander Staff College, and that was a good contact. Of course, those things have really changed now, and I'll come back to that later on. When the Swedish defense debate, so to speak, restarted around 2012, 2 issues were in focus. First of all, if Russia was at all a threat. The conservative chairman of the Defense Committee contended that, I quote, "Russia is heading east, and this makes Europe safer for a long time," unquote. The Prime Minister at that time, Reinfeldt, also a conservative, stressed as early as January 2014, and I quote again, "Russia's armed forces are toasted and destroyed, and there is no aggressive threat against Sweden," unquote. The second question of those 2 I mentioned earlier concerned the defense budget. Since expenditures increased, while real-world funding declined for about 20 years in the Swedish armed forces, the defense economy has always been an exercise in cuts. Especially when new systems have been acquired, always something else had to go, even if it was modern. The famine that has undergone in the armed forces had led to a reduction in the ability and function as a whole and as one entity. However, at present, those 2 questions are partly resolved. In Sweden, both the Security Police and the Swedish Agency for Contingency Planning have pointed to Russia's psychological warfare and influence operations. Finally, and most clearly, the Defense Committee has stated that Sweden is inevitably affected by conflict in the immediate area and choose to once again dimension the armed forces for defense of Swedish territory. We have a new task again, or an old task coming back. The national defense is the most important for the Swedish armed forces. Only a few months ago, an increase in defense deficits was the most important issue on the political agenda. Now the political opposition has agreed to increase the defense budget to 2% of the GDP in the long term, if they win the election this fall. And just now it's a little bit under 1%, so it's a doubling of the budget if they win the election. And this has put significant pressure on the opposite, that is the governmental bloc. Although the question is not resolved, and it's still crucial, there seems to be sufficient political support for an increase in the military spending in Sweden. However, when those two issues fall off the agenda, one question remains even more difficult and is still unresolved. What do we do with our power tools? What do we do with the armed forces? Our biggest security policy shortcoming is the lack of strategy. That is a realistic and coherent idea of how we will use our resources. Our leadership devotes a lot of energy to unilaterally thinking of our abilities, but very little strategy. The fact that the strategy is decisive in a conflict is a story full of examples. Weak players with good strategy have managed to beat stronger opponents. For example, in Cuba, or in Vietnam, and also in other places. In real terms, I think the strategy must have a reasonable assumption of what causes and affects an international politics, and in particular what changes Russia's behavior. I argue that we have not understood Russia enough in this regard. The Swedish actions have been based on two relatively thin assumptions. First of all, the more we increase the cooperation with Russia, the more likely they are to cooperate and embrace our values. Second, the more we work for democracy and human rights, the more likely they are to gain entry into Russia. Those two goals may have an ethical value, but we should be aware that the will to affect Russian politics is seen by the Russian regime as subversion and as a threat. It rather increases the level of conflict than decreases it. Sweden does not have a coherent strategy that forces our power to move in the same direction. Instead of synergies, Sweden's security policy is characterized by sub-optimization and sometimes rather opposing interest. One of the clearest examples of this in recent time is the issue of the United Nations Convention on Global Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Defense Minister Hultqvist wants to safeguard our partnerships with, for example, NATO and the United States, and is therefore against signing the convention. Foreign Minister Wallström, however, wants to support the ban with little likelihood of achieving anything but crushing our partners. The fact that different ministries have different views on one question may not be so strange, but this should be discussed in closed rooms, not to damage our international relations or our credibility. The overall coordination must be at an inside the governmental level discussion. So going back to the military strategy in Sweden, it's difficult to have a military strategy if there is not a political overall strategy. But one could say that our Supreme Commander has formed some sort of military strategy, and it is, if I can use buzzwords, said not to lose alone and to win together with others. I will not elaborate on that especially, but we can talk about that later. But I wonder, and we wonder, who are the others? Is it Finland? Is it United States? Is it the United Kingdom? Or maybe is it NATO? But we are not a NATO member. And what are the willingness and what are the strategy from those countries or organizations mentioned to support Sweden in an armed conflict? And then I come back to strategies from those organizations, and this for NATO and for the countries in Western Europe. Do they really have strategies? And to be a little bit offensive, we often discuss strategy. But sometimes I get the feeling that this is the subject of national defense colleges. I know that we discuss it in the Swedish National Defense College, they do it in the Finnish National Defense College, they do it in the Norwegian Defense College, and I know that you do it here. But is this taken back to the armed forces to make a real military strategy? I think there is a lack of military, at least explained military strategies in many of the small countries in Europe. And the minister earlier today said about France that they were the only country in Europe that had a real long-term strategy. And even though she was contradicted, from my knowledge, I think she is right. So I think that we have to walk the walk and start taking the strategy that we are talking about in the different national defense colleges. We are talking about the art of war and strategy, and we have to bring that back to the plans in the military, armed forces, their headquarters, and on the political level. Thank you very much.
Meine Damen und Herren, ich habe sehr genau zugehört.
I was listening very attentively, and you'll probably notice, if you did that too, that we've had the panelists, all of these panelists were very open and indirectly had a message that runs as follows: the military actually are not integrated in the military strategies, or if they take part, it's not strategy or it's not wanted. I'm glad that the commandant here is still with us, because the next strategy will need to be drafted and worked on also in Lavak and the academy here. Because every time we have a change of regime, new points are being taken into question, not only in Austria. Look at the White Book of Germany, of the Bund, where the word strategy is mentioned only once in this White Book. 2 or 3 times strategies mentioned. Most strategies in Europe, and the European security strategy by Solano, and also the one from 2016, was very well written, beautifully done, but does not say what the European Union wants, does not say how it wants to achieve it, and it doesn't say what means it has for this. The authors of the strategy explained this in Alpbach, because it was not possible to actually get the countries to the point where they would simply agree for certain items to be included in the strategy. It was apparently worse under Solano before. So if we write strategies in Europe, I would like to thank especially Generals Anderson and General Pacek. We have to rethink our strategies, rewrite them, think them differently and write them differently. We cannot just put in everything that's bad in the world, and then when it comes to strategy, say, actually there's nothing we can do because we have no money. This is the wrong approach. Thank you also for all your comments regarding threats. We have a little time for questions. I would like to say a few points. Thank you for pointing out the dangers of manipulation of language. I have covered this topic with students, and mind and language. This is a topic that is actually quite important. Political correctness has actually hurt. And we have the opposite effect now, that we cannot really do away with political correctness. But with the new situation that we have in the EU, there was an article in the Washington Post on this, that this article was actually being deleted because it did not meet the guidelines of the EU. Now, hey, this is a dangerous situation. We are being monopolized on formal grounds, and this is certainly a danger that I see in the future. That I'm happy you pointed out what dangers are there inherent in language. Also, thank you for the other contributions, because what was interesting is that the Russian leadership theory on the Crimean War is actually turning everything into mathematics and calculating it. And then when it's actually on the brigade level, then all of a sudden people are supposed to take individual decisions. That was very interesting. And Professor Patrick, who changed from being a general to being a professor, now that was great information. I've never really heard it like this. If you did this and brought it to paper in German, this would be quite a bombshell, if I may say so. I've heard again the Russians have not attacked. They actually did this, did that in eastern Poland and other parts of the country. They were waging wars. They went to Korea in the 80s and 90s of the 19th century. All of this is forgotten. It didn't take place because Mama Merkel said we don't want to have this language. It's all pushed aside and forgotten. So, great. General Anderson, großartig. This was great. This is the challenge. The German Bundeswehr have actually only now 340 tanks. Artillery is gone, almost everything. The Dutch have actually done away with their entire tanks group formation. I come from the Air Force. There are 600 fighter bombers. Sweden now is going the opposite way. 60, sorry, correct. And they don't have the money to operate them. And these are things that must change now. We have a defense budget of 0.6%. Look how many European states have more than we do on a percentage basis. At least we have a functioning military, and we have a well-functioning traditional system and army barracks system. Actually, good leadership system. Not all countries in Europe have that. I've heard people say when they come back, well, I'm happy I'm back. So there is room for improvement everywhere, also here in Austria. But one has to put this into the right context and definitely talk about where do we want to go. Now we have some time for questions. Is there any? Nobody has any question? Oh, yes. Professor Belozerov. English or Russian? It was very interesting to listen to your talks. We have heard a lot today about the Russian side and the Russian doctrine. I have a question. I would like to quote a lecture, and then I would like to ask the question. During the meeting of the board, Gerasimov said about the operation of the Russian troops in the commandants of the terrorists were actually trained in a special way. The military advisors were gotten from Europe and the Mideast. In special cases, the officers of these countries were leading the illegal troops. So I have a question. Is this hybrid war? And whose hybrid war is it, and against whom? Please use a microphone.
Yes, of course we have different sides and different pictures of the hybrid war. And General Gerasimov, he described very generally. He didn't explain future Russian war. He gave the picture of future wars. Very generally. I don't want to use political language. I don't want to use, the political point of view. I am a professor now. This is why I would like to say that one side is what is the Gerasimov opinion, and the other side is a realistic picture, what is going on in Ukraine, because if you have time, I am ready. I am ready to talk about details. To be very open and to be very frank, the hybrid warfare, according to Gerasimov, according to Hoffman, according to many other generals, professors, is very similar and the same about the evidences. Of course, we can assess using own point of view. My point of view is very clear, you know it.
Die Frage ist ja noch nicht richtig.
Well, you haven't really answered the question correctly. Special forces in Syria, how they actually have worked in the anti-Bad organization, the organizations that support the Russians, and how they proceed there. And if we now take our topic, asymmetrical warfare, and this was the question asked, is this old wine in new tubes, or is this would be interesting to hear from the experts, especially their opinions on asymmetrical warfare, because they were just looking at the special forces of Russia. Wouldn't it be more honest to say it's old tubes and go back to some lectures that supported this approach? Also, the Americans who actually introduced the word asymmetry are also the inventors, because this is what they did in the Civil War, in the War of Independence. They introduced elements of asymmetry then, and there were elements of containment, and all the follow documents show that this was certainly part of the warfare then.